October 30th, 1917, Passchendaele Ridge, Belgium. The Third Battle of Ypres was entering its fourth month of continuous operations. The Canadian Corps under Lieutenant General Arthur Currie's command had been fighting for control of Passchendaele Ridge since October 26th. 4 days of advance measured in meters, not kilometers. 4 days of conditions that defied every known description of modern warfare. The 72nd Battalion, Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, held positions on the western slope of the ridge. They'd advanced 400 meters in 4 days through terrain that had ceased to be recognizable as land. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 consecutive weeks. The entire Ypres salient had transformed into a swamp of liquid mud that swallowed men, horses, and equipment without discrimination. Artillery craters filled with water deep enough to drown a man in full kit. Visibility was poor, despite a nearly full moon that remained hidden behind constant cloud cover. Weather conditions were typical for Passchendaele in October. Perpetual drizzle, temperature near 7 degrees Celsius, southwest wind at 16 kilometers per hour. But what was about to happen that night would forever change the understanding of what truly occurred on those battlefields. Because what descended from the sky at 3:40 in the morning would defy everything these soldiers understood about physics, technology, and warfare. Sergeant Malcolm Duncan McAllister, 28 years old, from New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. He'd enlisted in September 1914, 3 weeks after war was declared. He'd served with the 72nd Battalion since its formation in 1915. He'd survived Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, and the first 4 days of Passchendaele. He'd been decorated for valor at Courcelette during the Battle of the Somme. He was known among his men as unshakable, rational, impossible to rattle emotionally. He'd watched artillery transform landscapes into moonscapes. He'd observed men drown in mud-filled craters. He'd rescued wounded soldiers from shell holes while under machine gun fire. 3 years of war had shown him every horror modern conflict could produce. Nothing had prepared him for what he would witness in the early morning hours of October 30th. In a moment, you'll discover why 22 more soldiers would corroborate exactly what McAllister saw that night, and why all those reports were classified in under 4 hours. At approximately 3:40 in the morning, Sergeant McAllister was conducting a routine inspection of forward observation posts in C Company sector. German artillery had been silent for nearly an hour, unusual for this sector, where bombardment was almost constant. Weather was typical: steady drizzle, low fog, visibility reduced to less than 200 meters in most directions. He first noticed the light while speaking with Lance Corporal William Fraser at Post 14, a brilliant white light descending slowly from cloud cover approximately 450 meters to their northeast. He called Fraser's attention to it immediately. Lance Corporal William Fraser, 24 years old, from Halifax, confirmed the sighting at once. What they observed over the next 8 minutes defied everything they understood about aeronautics, physics, and military technology. A spherical object, intensely luminous with white-blue light, approximately 4.5 meters in diameter based on comparison with visible terrain features. It was descending at a constant rate of approximately 15 meters per minute, too slow for any known aircraft, too controlled to be flares or illumination shells. Completely silent. This detail was crucial. The rain continued falling at its steady pace. German machine gun fire could be heard clearly from pillboxes 550 meters away. Allied artillery operated kilometers behind the lines, their detonations clearly audible across the valley. This massive nearby object produced no sound whatsoever. No engine roar, no whistling of displaced air, no mechanical noise of any kind.
But what was about to happen would turn this observation into something far more disturbing than a simple, unexplained sighting. They weren't alone witnessing this. Before dawn, 23 men from 3 different companies would file reports describing the same object with identical details. By 8 o'clock that same morning, every one of those reports would be classified by Canadian Corps Intelligence. Within 6 weeks, the first witness would be dead. Sergeant McAllister's report, filed at 4:50 in the morning on October 30th to Captain Harold Benson, C Company commander, described the object in meticulous detail. According to his field diary, recently digitized by Library and Archives Canada in 2019, the object maintained its descent until reaching approximately 15 meters above no man's land. At this altitude, it remained stationary for approximately 2 minutes. The light it emitted was described as white with a blue-green corona, intense enough to illuminate the ground beneath it in a circle approximately 30 meters in diameter. The mud, water, and debris of no man's land were clearly visible under this illumination. Most significant was that the light didn't behave like any known illumination source. Star shells, the standard artillery illumination rounds used by both sides, created intense white light with distinctive flickering and clearly visible smoke trails. This light was constant, uniform, and produced no visible exhaust, smoke, or identifiable suspension mechanism. What happened next was witnessed by 12 additional witnesses in adjacent positions, and it would change the course of 23 lives forever.
Then, according to Lance Corporal Fraser's testimony, and confirmed by 12 more witnesses in adjacent positions, the object began its final descent. It descended slowly to the ground, coming to rest in an artillery crater approximately 270 meters from the advanced Canadian trenches. The crater, designated as Crater 47 on battalion maps, was approximately 9 meters in diameter and filled with nearly a meter of standing water. The object settled into this crater. Its light dimmed but didn't extinguish completely. A blue-white glow emanated from the crater, visible from Canadian positions even through the fog. Captain Benson, observing through field binoculars from company headquarters, reported in his log that the object appeared to be resting on or within the water. Its surface, when visible through breaks in the fog, appeared metallic and smooth. It showed no openings, had no obvious propulsion system, bore no markings of any kind. It was a perfectly smooth object, resting in mud-contaminated water in the middle of no man's land between 2 opposing armies. There was no German reaction. No artillery targeted the light. No machine gun fire attacked it. No German flares or signals acknowledged it. It was as if, to German forces across no man's land, the object simply didn't exist or didn't represent a threat requiring response. Because the real threat wasn't the object itself, but what it was about to do when someone got close enough to investigate. After 15 minutes of continuous observation, Captain Benson made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He requested volunteers to investigate the object. The reasoning seemed sound from a military perspective. The object remained stationary in Crater 47. No unusual German activity had been detected. The opportunity to identify what had landed between the lines appeared worth the calculated risk. 3 men stepped forward without hesitation. Sergeant Malcolm McAllister, 28 years old. He'd survived 3 years of war. He'd been recommended for officer commission twice and declined both times, preferring to remain with his men in the trenches. His experience and leadership made him the obvious choice to lead the investigation. He was the kind of man other soldiers would follow anywhere, even across no man's land in total darkness. Corporal James Edward Davies,
25 years old, from Victoria, British Columbia. He'd enlisted in 1915, trained as a scout, served with distinction at Hill 70. He was known for maintaining calm under enemy fire and possessing exceptional observation skills. His role would be to document everything they saw, take note of every observable technical detail. Private Robert Thompson, 22 years old, from Toronto, Ontario, he joined the battalion as a replacement in August 1917. He'd survived his first major battle at Passchendaele. He volunteered despite having only 2 months of frontline experience. He was young, but he demonstrated courage under fire, and that was qualification enough in Passchendaele's trenches. At 4:08 in the morning, the 3 men left the Canadian trenches. They carried rifles, Mills bombs, signal flares, and a field telephone cable that would allow constant communication with company headquarters. The plan was simple and straightforward. Advance to the crater, observe the object at close range, signal back their findings via field telephone, and return to Canadian lines. Expected mission duration, 20 minutes maximum. 23 soldiers watched their advance across no man's land. The mud made movement slow and treacherous. The 3 men maintained standard tactical spacing, approximately 9 meters between each soldier, to minimize casualties in case of enemy fire. McAllister led, followed by Davies, with Thompson managing the telephone cable that unspooled behind them like an umbilical cord connecting them to the trenches. They reached the crater at 4:15 in the morning. The object was still there, still emitting its white-blue glow that illuminated the contaminated water and surrounding mud. From the Canadian trenches, observers with field binoculars watched the 3 men approach the crater's edge. McAllister signaled back using previously agreed-upon gestures. All clear, investigating further. No one in those trenches imagined this would be the last coherent signal they'd receive from the 3 men. Hit subscribe if you want to understand how an unknown object could land in the middle of a war zone without provoking response from either side, because what comes next reveals what happened when those 3 soldiers got too close to something they should never have investigated.
The 3 men began descending into the crater's interior. The white-blue light intensified as they approached the object. From the trenches, observers could see their silhouettes clearly outlined against the glow. Then, according to Lance Corporal Fraser, who was manning the field telephone, McAllister's voice came through the line. The transmission was initially clear, no unusual static interference. He reported that the object measured approximately 3.5 meters in height, resting partially in the crater's water. Its surface appeared seamless, like polished metal, with no visible joints, rivets, or welds of any kind. He reported it was warm to the touch. The water around it was steaming despite the cold October night. Then Davies' voice came through the telephone, urgent but controlled. He reported that something was opening on the object's surface. A section of the hull was retracting inward. An opening approximately 1.80 meters in height was forming on the side of the object facing Canadian lines. The light from inside the object was intensely bright, white-blue, painful to observe directly, even through binoculars from 270 meters away. Fraser asked over the telephone if they could see inside. McAllister's response was affirmative. Yes, something was visible inside, but they couldn't make out exactly what. The light was too intense, creating a glare that prevented seeing specific details. But there was something inside, structures or shapes that weren't simply the empty interior of a metal container. And just when it seemed they'd maintain a safe distance, something changed in the communication that froze the blood of everyone listening. Davies' voice again, describing they were moving closer to the opening to attempt better observation of the interior. Thompson reported that the interior appeared to extend much deeper than the object's external dimensions should allow. It was a geometrical impossibility.
The object measured 3.5 meters in height externally, but the interior appeared to have a depth of at least 6 or 7 meters. Then the transmission became incomprehensible, intense static, followed by what sounded like voices, multiple voices speaking in unison, not English, not German, not French, not any language Fraser recognized. They weren't human sounds, produced by human vocal cords. They were mechanically produced tones, modulated in patterns that didn't correspond to any known language. The voices continued for approximately 30 seconds that seemed to stretch eternally. Then McAllister's voice returned to the telephone line, but it had changed completely. Flat, emotionless, mechanically stating 4 words that made no sense in the context of a military reconnaissance mission. "We're going inside." Fraser shouted into the telephone immediately. "Negative, return immediately, abort mission, direct order." No response. The telephone line cut off abruptly. From the trenches, observers watched the 3 men disappear inside the opening in the object.
What you'll discover next explains why only one of those 3 men would ever see daylight again, and why he could never explain what had happened to his companions. The light from the opening intensified until it was painful to observe, even at 270 meters away. Observers had to look away or cover their eyes. Then it dimmed rapidly, almost instantaneously. The opening closed. The white-blue glow from the crater diminished to a faint luminescence, barely visible. Captain Benson ordered continued observation. No movement from the crater. No signals from the investigation team. The telephone line remained dead despite attempts to re-establish contact. Minutes passed. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady rain and occasional German machine gun fire in distant sectors. At 4:45 in the morning, 30 minutes after the men had entered the object, something emerged from the crater. A single figure, moving erratically, stumbling, falling repeatedly in the mud. It took the figure 18 minutes to cover the 270 meters back to Canadian lines. 18 minutes of tortured advance, frequent falls, movements that didn't seem fully coordinated. Sergeant Malcolm McAllister, alone. When he reached the trench, he collapsed immediately. The soldiers who helped him over the parapet reported his condition at once to the medical officer. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, pupils dilated despite the surrounding darkness. He was shaking violently, tremors running through his entire body. His uniform was dry, despite having crossed 270 meters of waterlogged, muddy terrain. He wouldn't release his rifle. When medical orderlies attempted to examine him, he attacked blindly, shouting words that made no sense, phrases in a language no one recognized. The company medical officer, Captain Douglas McKinnon of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, sedated him within minutes. McAllister's field diary ended with the entry marked at 4:08 in the morning, departing for crater investigation. No subsequent entries exist. His rifle, when finally removed from his grip, was examined. Forensic analysis conducted in 2008 on the preserved weapon maintained at the Canadian War Museum revealed anomalies that were never explained. The metal components showed signs of exposure to extreme heat, warping and discoloration consistent with temperatures exceeding 426 degrees Celsius. Yet his uniform showed no burn damage of any kind. Chemical residue on the weapon didn't correspond with any explosive, propellant, or industrial compound known to be used in 1917. The residue remains unidentified to this day. But this was just the beginning of the real horror, because what had happened to McAllister was barely the first act of a suppression that would extend across decades.
Corporal James Davies and Private Robert Thompson were never seen again. Their bodies were never recovered. No trace of them was ever found. They're listed as missing in action, presumed dead, October 30th, 1917. Their names appear on the Menin Gate Memorial to the missing, alongside 54,000 more names of soldiers with no known graves. The object in Crater 47 remained visible until approximately 5:20 in the morning. As dawn approached, the glow faded completely. At first light, 5:45 in the morning, a Canadian artillery observer reported that the crater appeared empty. A reconnaissance patrol sent at 6 o'clock in the morning, during a brief pause in German fire, reached the crater. The water in the crater was significantly warmer than surrounding shell holes, approximately 26 degrees Celsius, according to measurements taken. The mud at the bottom showed unusual compression patterns, as if something extremely heavy had rested there for an extended period. No debris, no remains, no physical evidence of the object that had been there barely an hour before. The patrol found no trace of Davies or Thompson, nothing, as if they'd never existed. Within 48 hours, the incident was classified. Intelligence officers from Canadian Corps headquarters arrived at the battalion's position on November 1st. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Morrison and Major William Stephenson, both from Corps Intelligence Section, conducted interviews with all witnesses. Those who survived remember the interrogations clearly. Lance Corporal Fraser, interviewed in 1968 by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for a documentary about Passchendaele, described the process. He stated verbatim, "They weren't interested in what we saw. They wanted to know who we'd told, who else knew, what we'd written down. Every notebook, every diary, every letter home was confiscated. They took everything." All written records related to the incident were confiscated. Field diaries, personal letters, sketches, maps marking the crater's location, anything documenting the event was collected and removed. Captain Benson's company log for October 30th contains entries up to 3:30 in the morning. The next entry is marked at 6 o'clock in the morning. The critical 2.5 hours are blank. An annotation in different handwriting states entries removed by order of Corps Intelligence November 1st, 1917. And what happened to those witnesses after the classification would reveal a pattern that continues to this day.
The witnesses were separated and reassigned immediately. Fraser was transferred to the 73rd Battalion on November 3rd. Private Andrew McLeod, who had observed the entire incident through field binoculars, found himself assigned to the 78th Battalion. Corporal David Robertson, who had monitored the field telephone, was sent to Corps Signals Company. The official explanation was operational requirements necessitating redistribution of experienced personnel. The effect was to scatter 23 witnesses across the entire Canadian Corps, ensuring they couldn't compare notes or coordinate testimony. They were fragmented, isolated, separated from anyone who could corroborate their story. Sergeant McAllister was evacuated to Canadian General Hospital No. 3 in Boulogne on November 2nd. His medical file, obtained through access to information requests filed in 2015, describes his condition in clinical detail. Acute neurasthenia, severe psychological trauma, inability to communicate coherently, violent outbursts requiring constant physical restraint. Attempts to interrogate him about the incident resulted in complete catatonic withdrawal or explosive violence. He was transferred to Ontario Military Hospital, Orpington, England, on November 15th. There he remained for 14 months under the care of Captain Thomas Ridley, Royal Army Medical Corps. Captain Ridley's notes, partially declassified in 1998, describe a patient who alternated between complete silence and episodes of rapid speech in what Ridley described as mechanical, emotionless repetition of incomprehensible phrases.
They weren't random ravings of a traumatized man. They were specific phrases, repeated word for word, as if he was reciting something that had been programmed into his mind. On December 12, 1917, McAllister spoke clearly for the first time since October 30th. According to Ridley's notes, McAllister stated, "They were inside, Davies and Thompson, inside, but they weren't themselves anymore." When asked what this meant, McAllister became violent, requiring immediate sedation. He didn't speak clearly again for 3 months. You'll discover later why keeping him alive but silenced was more convenient than eliminating him outright.
Smash that subscribe button if McAllister's fate is disturbing you, because what follows is the statistically impossible pattern of deaths that systematically eliminated everyone who witnessed what landed at Passchendaele. In March 1918, McAllister was transferred to Ontario Hospital, Whitby, Ontario, Canada, a psychiatric institution. He spent the rest of his life there, locked in a facility designed to contain those society deemed too damaged to function. Visits from family members, documented in hospital records, describe a man who appeared physically present but mentally absent. His sister, Margaret McAllister, wrote to the Department of Militia and Defense in June 1918 requesting information about what had happened to her brother. The response, dated July 3, 1918, stated that Sergeant McAllister had suffered severe psychological trauma during combat operations, and that specific circumstances are classified under the War Measures Act. No additional explanation was provided. Sergeant Malcolm Duncan McAllister died at Ontario Hospital on February 8, 1919. Official cause of death, pneumonia complicated by general weakness. He was 29 years old. The attending physician, Dr. Harold Bennett, noted on the death certificate that McAllister had been in isolation for the 2 weeks prior to his death, no visits and minimal contact with staff. His final comprehensible words, spoken to a night orderly on February 7th, were recorded in the orderly's log. "They were inside. We're all inside now. They're coming back." He died 6 hours later. His personal effects, scheduled to be returned to his family in New Glasgow, never arrived. His sister filed inquiries in 1919, 1920, and 1922. The Department of Militia and Defense responded each time that the effects had been lost during shipping or misfiled during demobilization procedures. His service medals, including the military medal awarded for valor at Courcelette, were never recovered. Every physical trace of Malcolm McAllister, except his name in official records, was systematically eliminated. But McAllister was just the first. What comes next will reveal how 14 of 23 witnesses ended up dead in circumstances that defy statistical probability. Lance Corporal William Fraser survived the war. He was discharged in March 1919, returned to Halifax, worked as a longshoreman on the docks. He married, had 3 children, lived a quiet and apparently normal life. He never spoke publicly about Passchendaele until 1968, when he accepted an interview for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation documentary. During that interview, he described the October 30th incident in complete detail. The footage was recorded but never broadcast. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation archives list the interview as recorded October 1968, destroyed in fire January 1971. The fire at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation facility in Toronto in January 1971 destroyed approximately 40,000 hours of archived material. Fraser's interview was among the destroyed recordings. No transcript was ever made. William Fraser died on October 31, 1968. 1 day after the 51st anniversary of the incident. He suffered a fatal heart attack while walking home from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation studio where he'd recorded the interview. He was 75 years old. The coroner's report noted he had no prior history of heart disease. Coincidences. In a moment, you'll understand why the word coincidence stops having meaning when the pattern repeats itself 14 times. Private Andrew McLeod, transferred to the 78th Battalion after the incident, was killed on November 6, 1917, 7 days after witnessing the landing. The official record states he was struck by German artillery while moving between positions. His body was recovered by stretcher bearers who noted his wounds were inconsistent with artillery fragmentation. The medical officer who examined the body, Captain George Wilson of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, wrote in his report, "Cause of death uncertain. Wounds suggest close-range trauma, not artillery. Investigation requested." The request was denied. The investigation never happened. McLeod was buried at Tyncott Cemetery. He was 26 years old. Corporal David Robertson, transferred to Corps Signals Company, died in a field hospital in March 1918. Shrapnel wounds, according to the official record. The surgeon who operated, Major Frederick Hamilton, noted in his personal diary that the wounds didn't correspond with the artillery shrapnel pattern. He wrote, "Deep penetrating trauma, inconsistent with fragmentation, more consistent with bayonet wound or edged weapon. Patient died during surgery." The diary was discovered in 2011 at an estate sale. Robertson was 27 years old. Private Kenneth Murray, observer at Post 14 during the sighting, survived the war. He returned to Montreal in 1919. He worked at a textile factory. In 1921, he died in an industrial accident, a poorly maintained loom, according to the accident report. Witnesses at the factory stated Murray had worked on that loom for 2 years without incident. The accident occurred on October 30th, 1921, the exact 4th anniversary of the incident. He was 24 years old. Private Thomas Brennan, who had observed the object's descent through binoculars, was medically discharged in 1918. He returned to Toronto. In 1922, he disappeared. His wife reported his disappearance to police on November 2, 1922. He'd gone out to buy cigarettes the night of October 31st and never returned. His body was never found. He was declared legally dead in 1929. He was 26 years old when he vanished. And just when it seemed the deaths could be explained away as casualties of war and post-war life, the cases became impossible to ignore.
Private Patrick Collins, who had been at Post 13 during the sighting, was hospitalized at Veterans Military Hospital in Halifax in 1920. Diagnosis: severe neurasthenia, symptoms similar to McAllister's. He died in the hospital on March 15, 1921. Official cause: respiratory failure. The medical record notes he'd been in complete isolation for the 3 weeks prior to his death. He was 28 years old. Private Raymond Hutchinson committed suicide in 1922. He threw himself in front of a streetcar in Vancouver on October 29th. The streetcar driver testified at the inquest that Hutchinson had been standing on the platform for several minutes, then simply stepped forward as the streetcar approached. No suicide note, no signs of depression according to family members. He was 25 years old. Corporal Ernest Shaw died in 1923 in a house fire at his Ottawa apartment. The fire department report stated the fire started in his bedroom while he slept. Probable cause: lit cigarette. His wife stated Shaw didn't smoke. The fire occurred on October 30th, 1923. He was 30 years old. Between October 30th, 1917 and December 1924, 14 of the 23 documented witnesses to the Passchendaele landing died or disappeared. 2 vanished during the investigation itself. 4 were killed in combat in the war's final year, all within 6 weeks of the incident. 3 died in hospitals from various complications: pneumonia, influenza, unexplained organ failure. 2 died in accidents during the 20s, 1 in a factory incident, 1 struck by a streetcar. 2 committed suicide in psychiatric facilities. 1 disappeared in 1922, never found. What you'll discover next explains why these numbers aren't just statistics, but evidence of something far more deliberate. The statistical probability of this mortality rate was calculated in 1997 by Dr. Robert Mackenzie, a statistician at McGill University analyzing World War I casualty patterns. His study, conducted as part of a broader investigation into combat trauma, included the Passchendaele witnesses as a data subset. The probability of 14 deaths out of 23 men within 7 years, given their age, health, and survival of frontline combat, was 1 in 47,000. These weren't men in the same unit suffering collective casualties in a single battle. These were individuals scattered across different battalions, different cities, different countries after demobilization. Yet they were dying at a rate that defied statistical probability.
The incident might have remained buried forever, if not for Dr. Graham Prescott, a military historian at the University of Toronto. In 1986, while researching Canadian participation at Passchendaele, he discovered a cryptic reference in a 72nd Battalion soldier's partially destroyed diary. The entry, dated October 31, 1917, mentioned the light that landed in no man's land and 3 men who never came back right. What began as curiosity became obsession. For 8 years, Prescott tracked down survivors, obtained documents through access to information requests, and meticulously reconstructed what had been carefully dismantled. In 1994, Prescott presented his findings at an academic conference in Ottawa. He described the October 30th incident, the witness death pattern, the systematic suppression of evidence. The presentation was recorded. Conference archives list the recording as misplaced during archive reorganization in 1996. Prescott planned to publish a book about the incident. The manuscript was complete by September 1994. On October 30th, 1994, exactly 77 years after the incident, Dr. Graham Prescott died in a car accident on Highway 401 near Toronto. Single vehicle, no other cars involved. The accident report states his vehicle left the road at high speed and struck a concrete pillar. Probable cause, fell asleep at the wheel. He was 52 years old. His manuscript, stored in his University of Toronto office, disappeared before his family could claim it. The university reported a break-in at its history building 3 days after his death. Only Prescott's office was entered. Only his Passchendaele research was taken. No other property was reported missing. In 2003, investigative journalist Sarah Mackenzie began investigating the incident after discovering Prescott's story. She contacted survivors of witnesses' families, obtained documents Prescott had collected, began reconstructing the pattern. In 2006, she published a preliminary article in a Canadian military history journal. The article generated significant interest. Mackenzie received offers from several publishers to expand her investigation into a book. She began in-depth work in 2007. On October 30, 2008, Sarah Mackenzie was found dead in her Toronto apartment. Official cause: accidental overdose of prescription medication. The coroner noted she had no history of substance abuse. She was 38 years old. Her research files, including interviews, documents, and photographic evidence, were seized by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as part of the investigation into her death. They were returned to her family 6 months later with the notation that certain materials relevant to ongoing national security had been retained. The retained materials were never specified. They were never returned. Because the suppression pattern didn't end in 1924, it simply adapted to new times and new methods. The official records remain largely sealed. The original reports filed by the 72nd Battalion are held at Library and Archives Canada under reference number RG9, Series 3, Volume 4917, File 243. Classification: Restricted Access. Sealed until 2044. Attempts to obtain their release under access to information laws have been consistently denied. In 2017, historian Marcus Chen filed a petition for partial declassification. The request was reviewed by the Department of National Defense. The response, after 18 months, stated, "Release of the requested material would be contrary to the public interest and could compromise national security." No additional explanation was provided. The public interest argument wasn't elaborated upon. How documents about events over 100 years old could still threaten national security was never explained. Files that have been released are heavily redacted. A 2019 release of 72nd Battalion intelligence summaries from October to November 1917 included 143 pages. Of these, 97 were so heavily redacted they contained fewer than 20 legible words per page. Sections corresponding to dates around October 30th were removed completely, with notation exempted under Section 21, National Security. You're watching this now because you sensed something was missing from the standard Passchendaele stories. The horror of the Third Battle of Ypres is well documented. The mud, the casualties, the impossible conditions, the strategic failure. All of this is known, studied, commemorated. But there was another layer to that horror, one that's been systematically erased from the historical narrative. Those Canadian soldiers saw something on October 30th, 1917, something that descended from the sky and landed in no man's land, something that opened and took two men who were never seen again, something that returned the third as an empty shell, unable to explain, unable to process, unable to ever recover. Their testimony was suppressed not because it wasn't reliable, but because it was too credible. They were silenced not because they were wrong, but because they were right. And the suppression pattern continues. Researchers who dig too deep into the Passchendaele incident find archives suddenly restricted. Access to information requests are denied on security grounds that make no logical sense for century-old events. Battalion war diaries that should contain entries for October 30th have pages removed or time periods blanked out. The suppression machinery, established during the war, remains operational over 100 years later. Why? What's still being protected? What truth about that night at Passchendaele, about what landed in Crater 47, about what happened to Davies and Thompson, about what McAllister saw inside that object, cannot be allowed into public consciousness? October 30th, 2027 marks the 110th anniversary of the Passchendaele landing. On that date in 1917, something came down from the night sky and waited in an artillery crater between the trenches. 3 men went to investigate. 2 never returned. The third spent his remaining days unable to explain what he'd witnessed, repeating words that never made sense to those who heard them. The date has taken on significance in certain circles. Researchers tracking similar phenomena, former military intelligence officers who recognize patterns in suppressed data, private organizations monitoring anomalous incidents in conflict zones. There are indications that October 30th, 2027 may witness renewed attention to the Passchendaele incident. A petition filed in 2024 before Library and Archives Canada requesting complete declassification of all Canadian Corps intelligence reports from October to November 1917 remains under review. Estimated decision date, October 2027. Whether October 30th, 2027 brings revelation, repetition, or simply another anniversary of suppressed truth remains to be seen. But for those who recognize the pattern, for those who understand what was witnessed and hidden, the date carries weight.
Drop a subscribe if this video changed your perspective on what really happened on World War I battlefields, because every week I break down the incidents governments classified a century ago and still refuse to explain.